Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and in this video we're going to discuss the most important events that took place during the previous 12 hours. We have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to talk about Kiev, because the most important things are coming exactly from this territory. For example, during the previous night, the Russians carried out massive missile strike in Ukraine, and the Russians were targeting and attacking the Ukrainian positions on the territory of the capital of Ukraine. We are talking about Kiev. The Russians attacked this city with a significant number of ballistic missiles and cruise missiles. Currently, it's very difficult to understand what exactly the Russians were trying to get, what kind of task the Russians were planning to complete, but most likely the Russians were trying to discover and to destroy the Ukrainian air defense. And at least this attack that took place yesterday, the previous night, was something like exercises and trainings before real and full-scale missile attack all over the entire territory of Ukraine that might happen if Zelensky doesn't start the negotiation process, and if Zelensky doesn't withdraw his troopers and forces from the Sudzha area. I'll remind you that yesterday the Russians raised in the sky several Tu-160 and Tu-22 with the purpose to attack Ukraine with missiles, but in the final point the Russians launched just decoys, fake missiles, and that was yesterday. Today we see the first attacks with the real missiles, and during the next several days most likely the Russians will carry out the massive missile strike all over the entire territory of Ukraine with the purpose maybe even to destroy the energy facilities. Now let's move further and let's talk about the Sudzha direction. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to improve their positions additionally, and let's talk about the northern direction. As you can see, we have a lot of very interesting changes. So first, let's discuss the village of Novoivanovka. Let's compare the map. This is the situation by the end of the 12th of November. This is the situation by the beginning of the 30th of November. And as you can see, during the previous 12 hours, the Russians managed to improve their positions by attacking the villages of Leonidovo and Alexandria from the south and trying to improve their positions in the eastern part of Novoivanovka. According to neutral mappers, the Russians managed to secure the village of Novoivanovka completely. As for Leonidovo and Alexandria, the Russians managed to reach the southwestern outskirts, but there are no presence of the Russians on the territory of these two settlements. Furthermore, the Russians continue suffering losses despite the progress, despite the additional changes on the ground. The Russians continue suffering losses. For example, in this video we can see abandoned vehicle of the armed force of Russian Federation that the Russians were planning to use or trying to use to cross small river, but the vehicle was damaged and destroyed, and the Russians abandoned these positions. But for example, in this video we can see several Russian vehicles, light vehicles, that were entering the southern part of these two settlements, and they were moving further. The Ukrainians were trying to stop them and to slow them down with FPV drones, but we see that the Ukrainians haven't managed to deal any damage. And in this part of the video we can see abandoned vehicle that was attacked by FPV drone. Attack of FPV drone took place exactly in this area. So as you can see, the Russians managed to break through and to enter these tree lines and these fortifications. Now the main purpose of the Russians is to dig in deeper and to improve their positions further in the southern direction with the purpose to cut the supply that goes in the direction of the villages like Leonidovo and Alexandria. So most likely these updates we're going to receive during the upcoming day. Now let's talk about the northern direction. During the previous night we also received another batch of videos of how the Ukrainians were attacking the Russian offensive forces. In this video we can see the Russian vehicle that probably got on mine and was destroyed. Later we got several more videos of how the Ukrainians were FPV droning the Russians personnel carriers. So all these, there are lots of episodes, but most of them were taking place exactly in this territory. Based on this video we have adjusted this part of the forest and the northern part of the forest. Now let's take a look and let's see how the map was developing since the beginning of the Kursk offensive operation. I'll remind you that the third part of counteroffensive started on the 7th of November, and this is the situation. This is how the front line looked like on the 7th of November by the beginning. This is the situation by the 8th of November. The Russians secured these three villages, and the source reported that the Russians entered the village of Darina. This is the situation by the 9th of November. The Russians managed to improve their positions in the eastern part of Pogribki. This is the situation by the 10th of November. The Russians secured the western part of Novosorochina and the western part of the village of Pogribki. This is on the 11th of November. The Ukrainians counterattack, conducted several counterattacks successful that allowed them to force the Russians to fall back in the northern direction. And basically the 11th of November was the turning point, because that was the last day when the Ukrainians managed to complete several successful counterattacks. After the 11th of November, the situation completely turned in Russian favor. The Russians got initiative in their hands and the Russians began advancing. Also by the 11th of November, we received first demarcation of Russian control over the northern part of Darina. Starting on the 12th of November, we have significant changes on the ground in the northern part. Lots of units were encircled, by the way, and they are still encircled without any possibilities to break through to their main forces, and the Russians began advancing in the eastern part of Novoivanovka. And by the beginning of the 13th of November, Novoivanovka was completely secured, and the Russians began offensive operation in the direction of two villages of Leonidova and Alexandria. So as you can see, the Russians continue advancing in the northern part. Obviously, the third counteroffensive is not going to stop by taking under control these two villages. Once again, most likely the third counteroffensive will finish when the Russians reach this line. This is the river of Mala Loknya. Now let's talk about the southeastern flank, and today we also got lots of very interesting updates from this territory. I'll just remind you that yesterday the Russians carried out very important and very successful special operation with the purpose to take positions between these two bridges. We discussed this situation yesterday. The Russians managed to take this territory under control and to break and ruin Ukraine logistic. And when logistic of the armed forces of Ukraine was destroyed, the Russians carried out several attacks in the direction of Kurakhove, and basically the Ukrainians shown no resistance in this area and were forced to fall back in the western direction towards the forest around the village of Kurakhove and towards the settlement by the name of Guiva. We made these conclusions based on the video that was published by the Ukrainians, and in this video we can see several FPV drone attacks on the Russian forces that were already located on the territory of Plechova. So a lot of episodes, a lot of strikes on the Russian positions. One of the FPV drone attack was geolocated exactly in this point. Russian positions were attacked here. Based on this video we have adjusted the map in Russian favor. So once again, this is how the situation was developing since the 11th of November. First, the Russians took under control this strategical position and cut the main supply road of the armed forces of Ukraine, and the next day the Russians managed to secure the village completely. Furthermore, the Ukrainians, as we discussed, are forced to concentrate forces as close as possible to the line of combat contact, to the front line, with the purpose to conduct and carry out successful rotations, evacuations, replacements, and many other things. And the Russians, of course, see everything. This foothold is not so big. There are flying the significant number of reconnaissance drone, and they can see everything, and when the Russians discover another concentration of forces, they attack this territory. For example, during the previous night we got the video of how the Russians made double strike with Iskander missiles, and as a result of these double strike, the significant number of Ukrainian forces were destroyed, armored vehicles, tanks, and personnel, of course. So this is the situation in this area. Once again, the Russians managed to the turning point has already come, and now the Russians have full initiative and they continue advancing. Now let's move further and let's talk about the Pokrov's direction, because we continue receiving very interesting updates from this territory as well. First, let's talk about the western part of Selido. As you can see, there are lots of icons. First of all, I would like to point your attention that the Russians managed to improve their positions on the territory of the village by the name of Yurivka. Currently, the Russians control around 20% of the settlement, maybe a little bit more, depends on the mapper. So these are the changes on the ground in comparison with 2 days. This is the situation by the end of the 12th of November. This is by the beginning of the 30th of November. Additional Russian progress on the territory of the settlement was confirmed by different mappers, both by neutral and pro-Ukrainian. So this is the situation in this area, and as we can see, the Russians are trying to move in the northwestern direction along the river by the name of Balka Sukha, with the purpose to answer the village of Pushtishka from the south. This water barrier is going to be natural defense line for the Russians, at least for this stage, so which means that the western flank would be secured by moving in the northwestern direction. Furthermore, as you can see, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to improve their positions also along the railways. As for this, we can see that the Russians are moving in the direction of the same village, but from the northeastern part. And currently, we can make a conclusion that the village of Pustinka was already caught in two pincers. The Russians are attacking from the south and from the northeast. Furthermore, the Russians intensified their FPV drone attacks in the villages of Grigorovka and the village of Petrovka. During the previous night, we got the video of the significant number of FPV drone attacks on Ukrainian vehicles that were abandoned in this area or were located in the same territory. The significant concentration of Russian FPV drone attacks confirms that most likely during the next several days or even hours, the Russians will try to attack these two villages like Petrovka and Grigorovka from two directions. First, the Russians will try to attack this area from the west, and the Russians will continue pressure from the east. And most likely this territory would be captured also by the Russians, maybe even by the end of this week. So now we see that's the first and the main Russian task to the west of Selidova, just to take everything inside of these red lines. Now let's move further and let's talk about the Kurakhove direction. We continue receiving videos from different angles of the current status of the dam. This is the picture from the very short distance of the consequences of explosion that took place here 2 days ago, and this is the video that was published by the Russians. And in this video we can see Russian drone that was flying above the dam right after the dam was destroyed. As you can see, the significant number of water currently is moving from the territory of the reservoir in the western direction and making additional problems for the Ukrainian supply and support. Now we don't know for sure the exact level of water that left the reservoir and the exact situation with the supply and support, but the sources are saying that the current situation is very difficult for the Ukrainians. Now let's talk about Ilinka. We have additional changes on the ground according to pro-Ukrainian mappers. According to information we have, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to improve their positions a little bit in the central part. Most likely during the next several days or one day, the village would be captured by the Russians completely. Now let's talk about Kurakhove. The Russians continue advancing, and today we got the video how the Russians destroyed the bridge between the central and the eastern part of Kurakhove, most likely with the purpose to reduce Ukrainian possibilities in supporting and supplying their forces in the eastern part, which means that currently the main Russian task is to secure the eastern part and then to outflank the central part from the south. So the bridge and the road was destroyed. Ukrainians lost any possibilities to support their forces in this part. There are several bridges to the south, but most likely these bridges also would be destroyed during the next day. Now let's talk about the southern cauldron, the territory between Uspenovka and Elizavetovka. According to different mappers, neutral and pro-Russian mappers, the Ukrainians began retreating process from their positions in these fields. Now the Ukrainians are trying to stick as close as possible to the village of Sukhiye Yale with the purpose to have access to the evacuation roads, and when orders to retreat comes, the Ukrainians want to be sure that they are able to abandon their positions as fast as possible in the direction of the villages like Kurakhove and Konstantinopol. So we can make a conclusion that Ukrainians began retreating process, and during the next 3-4 days we're gonna see completely different picture in the Kurakhove direction. Furthermore, we have additional changes on the ground that were confirmed by different videos. For example, in this video in the vicinity of Bogayavlenka, we can see how the Ukrainians were trying to counterattack the Russian forces in these three lines. That attack was repelled. These positions were under complete and strong control of the armored forces of Russian Federation, and the Ukrainians were counterattacking the Russian positions exactly along these three lines. This is the situation on the ground by the end of the 12th of November, and this is the situation by the beginning of the 30th of November. The Russians are trying to get as close as possible to the river of Sukhiye Yale and to the village of Veselugai by establishing complete FPV drone and artillery control over this evacuation road for the Ukrainians that are currently located on the territory of Elizavetovka. Furthermore, with the Russians, probably for the first time since the beginning of the South Donetsk operation, began publishing videos of how they were bombing and attacking the village of Sukhiye Yale. This concentration of aviation artillery strikes on the settlement tell us that most likely in the very near future the Russians will make first attempt to break through the Ukraine defense belt and to attack the village itself. Because maybe the Russians are just planning to try their luck, maybe they think that they can do this, because if the Russians are able to break through the defense to go through the fields and to answer the village of Sukhiye Yali by attacking like this, then this is going to be the complete disaster and the end for entire Kurakhove direction, because from this perspective, from these positions, this is going to be 100% cauldron without any possibilities for the Ukrainians on these territories to retreat and abandon their positions without suffering the significant losses. Now let's talk about the Zaporozhye direction, where the Russians the second day in a row continue their advancing in the direction of Novopol, and the Russians continue advancing in the direction of Rovnopol. So we have changes on the ground. For example, this is the situation by the end of the 12th of November. This is the situation by the beginning of the 30th of November. The Russians managed to semi-encircle Novodarivka from the west, and currently the Russians have already established complete fire control over the road between Novopol and Novodarivka itself. So the next target for the Russians is the village itself, and soon, maybe even by the end of this week, the settlement would be captured. The same story about Rovnopol. Both pro-Ukrainian and neutral mappers reported about 50% control over the entire settlement. Probably there is like a clearing operation. All the Russians are trying to secure the territory. Some sources on the ground are saying that there are still very heavy clashes. The Ukrainians are trying to counterattack, but as for Ukraine counterattacks, none of them led to the some progress for the Ukrainians. So they're retreating, and the situation for them is very difficult. And that's it for the short video. A military summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes to my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.